Their honorable governors, look at the time. Good evening. I wish to welcome you to this event on the launch of our flagship publication, the African Economic Outlook for 2022. The COVID-19 pandemic caused so much havoc in the world and so much pain. Our world lost so many precious lives to a virus we could not see. The pandemic also caused the worst global economic recession in the world since World War II. The real GDP growth rate in Africa declined by minus 1.6% by 2020 due to the economic downturns as tourism dipped and dried up, as commodity prices tumbled. This economic slump was the worst in Africa for decades. Africa lost 29 million jobs, and 30 million people fell into extreme poverty. Debt levels increased as debt to GDP ratio in Africa breached the north of 70%. The recovery for Africa will be very costly. Africa will need at least $432 billion to address the effects of COVID-19 on its economies and on the lives of its people, resources that it does not have. The measures being taken by the global community, or taken already by the global community, especially the Debt Service Suspension Initiative, the DSSI, the G20 Common Framework on Debt Treatment, and of course the issuance of the $650 billion in special drawing rights by the International Monetary Fund have all helped. For Africa, the African Development Bank launched a crisis response facility of up to $10 billion US. The bank also launched a $3 billion Fight COVID-19 social bond on the global capital market, which at the time that it was launched was the largest social bond ever in world history. The accumulation of these collective efforts and those of other financial institutions such as the World Bank, the IMF, and other international financial institutions, of course, as well as bilateral financiers, have helped a great deal. The real GDP growth of Africa recovered to 6.9% in 2021. As trade and tourism resumed, commodity prices increased, and due to the increased consumption and investment. This is good news, in fact, great news, although the growth now seems to have been tempered again due to the heightened global uncertainties because of Russia's war in Ukraine, which has rocked global commodity and financial markets yet again. The African Economic Outlook also focuses on the issue of climate change and the just energy transition, which form the theme of the annual meetings of the African Development Bank. The report shows that Africa needs a lot more financing to tackle climate change, but it came at it from a different perspective, or let me say, a new perspective. The global community has for many years been clamoring, and more recently at the COP26 in Glasgow, for developed countries to pay up on the $100 billion promised for developing countries on climate finance. The African Economic Outlook takes a very innovative modeling approach based on what I could call denied gains in Africa in terms of economic growth due to developed economies' carbon-intensive growth trajectories over decades and the wealth creation pathways, and goes on to show that indeed Africa has an allocative carbon credit of up to $4.8 trillion by 2050. That would mean that Africa is owed $173 billion annually between this year and 2050. It's a lot higher than the $18 billion that Africa got in terms of climate finance. You see the difference. It's a far cry from the financing Africa is getting today. You will find the report to be very illuminating, with excellent analytical and modeling works, used to make a very clear case for what the authors call carbon headroom for African economies to be able to grow. A very interesting and very novel concept. Let me thank you, Professor Kevin Urama, the acting chief economist and vice president of the bank, your directors and staff and partners for an excellent job on producing this highly informative African Economic Outlook for 2020. Enjoy the presentation. Thank you very much.
Today we have the opportunity to delve into the report at a high level, but a lot of work will still be done to go to various countries within the continent, to deep dive and really engage on what it means for each of our governments. And to do that, to give us the presentation, I would love to invite on stage Professor Kevin Chika Urama, who's also the acting chief economist and vice president of the African Development Bank. Welcome on stage. I'll give you a round of applause as well.
Thank you very much. Excellencies, dear governors of the African Development Bank Group, ladies and gentlemen, it's really a great pleasure for me and my team to be presenting to you today the African Economic Outlook report for the year 2022. As already gathered in this conference, climate change is an existential threat for Africa. Africa has contributed little to the global climate emissions, and Africa is suffering the most from climate change. So finding policies that can triangulate addressing climate impacts, which is real for Africa, and also allowing Africa to continue to grow within that carbon headroom that the President has introduced, was the subject of inquiry of this report. If we do that, we'll be able to achieve what we've called inclusive growth. The report is structured in 3 chapters. The first is on Africa's economic performance and outlook. The President has already painted the picture for 2020, 2021 and 2022. Then we looked at climate resilience and just energy transitions in Africa. The innovation here is that we have always been talking about climate resilience and meeting the global climate commitments. But we also know that the Sustainable Development Goals has as a key goal universal access to energy. And that is for a reason, because energy access is fundamental to achieving all the other goals that we have in the global goals for 2030. Financing climate resilience and just energy transitions becomes then very important for continents and countries suffering most from climate change, such as Africa. So this report is supposed to bring all this together and see where we can find the innovations and practices to be able to achieve that inclusive growth, triangulating the need to grow our economies, the need to be climate resilient, reduce emissions and adapt to climate change, and also the need to be able to find the financing required to reduce the impacts of climate on society. So I've already painted 3 pillars of sustainable development, which is old, since 2002 in the Broadland Report: the social, the economic, and the environmental. If we're able to do this in Africa, we will be a leader in terms of how to build the new inclusive growth paradigms that is being looked at. Chapter 1. In this picture, you see the growth deceleration to minus 1.6% that the President talked about in 2020, and the rapid regrowth that the rebound in Africa's growth to 6.9%. But shortly after, we have global tensions and other policy stance globally that is impacting the continent, and then we're projecting that in 2022 is going to decelerate to 4.1%. And 2023, that deceleration will continue. But if you look at that picture as well, you'll find that Africa, compared to other regions, didn't fare badly in terms of how we have responded to the COVID-19 pandemic. So I would like to give it up to our finance ministers, our heads of states, and our leaders for the rapid response policies that helped us to be able to bolster this shock, and also our global partners that came together and rallied with us to support. Now here is trying to look at the regional differentiations in this growth that we are seeing. North Africa had the highest rebound, recording a growth of up to 11.7% in 2021. But again, that deceleration to about 4.5% in 2022 because of the global challenges that we have been talking about here. West Africa, East Africa, and Central Africa have all gone back to positive growth after deceleration. To point out there, Eastern Africa did not have a contraction in 2020 because of several policies that they implemented, which you will find in the report. Because of what of time, I'm not going to delve into all those. And then Southern Africa, that was the hardest hit by this pandemic, that saw a contraction of 6%, is handsomely growing at 4.2% in 2020. But that's also projected to be a deceleration because of the issues that we have been talking about. Now, if you look at the economic characteristics of countries, whether they are oil exporters or resource-intensive, non-resource-intensive, tourism-dependent, we also see different patterns in terms of how this recovery has happened, with the tourism-dependent economies having the greatest rebound in its growth rate. But the oil-dependent economies, the oil exporting economies also did very well. So you find in the report the details of the key drivers of these growth changes that we are painting here. So I'm not going to go into depth because of time. Now, generally, we see that the macroeconomic fundamentals in many African countries has improved. But challenges still remain. The first of those challenges, the most pressing now, is the debt issue. And the president has already painted the picture for us that we see that tapering in the level of the growth, but of growth in our debt vulnerability and debt ratios as a ratio of our GDP. But we are predicting that it will stabilize still above 70%, above pre-pandemic levels. And the reasons for this are many. Domestic policies that needs to be implemented, public financial management that needs to be improved, but also exogenous shocks that are there that often impact Africa's economies. So this is an issue that we need to look at continuously. But again, we see consumer price inflation coming back into the picture, rising up to like 13.5% in 2020. So these are some of the two main challenges that African countries, from our perspectives as authors of this report, should focus on in the near term. Now, in terms of financing economic recovery, the president has already mentioned to us that Africa will need about $432 billion between 2020 and 2022 to respond to the COVID-19 pandemic impacts only. But we will see there are other financing needs that Africa also has. And Africa also needs more than a decade to recover from the COVID-19 impact. And if you look at the impacts of COVID-19, we were still doing this analysis when the Russia-Ukraine war broke. And currently, we see that in addition to that 30 million Africans that was pushed into extreme poverty because of COVID-19, up to 2 million will also slide into poverty in 2020, 2022, 2021, 2022, 2023 because of the Russia-Ukraine war already. If that war persists, the impacts will even be higher. Now, the next thing in the report, this seems not to be working. Okay, so these are just the figures about those who went into extreme poverty. So that's the painting of Africa's economic outlook, 2020 to 2023. But then we go into climate resilience and the just energy transitions. We looked at climate vulnerability, readiness, and resilience indicators across African economies and across the global economies, not just Africa, in order to put Africa in the map. And we find that Africa was the second least had the least climate vulnerability index. So in all countries, it's only South Asia that is more vulnerable to climate change than Africa was. And we showed the least climate readiness. If you look at other indicators, because of that combination of those factors, Africa is the least climate resilient region of the world. And then we try to look at different countries to see what are the things that's driving this climate vulnerability and climate readiness. And we find, you see, most of the countries here are not African countries. And they were more, Northern and Southern African countries were more climate ready and climate resilient. And if you look at the structure of their economy, it's also a little bit different. So that leads us to some initial conclusion that climate resilience and climate vulnerability is somehow linked to economic structures. So if you read the report, you'll find a little bit details. One interesting thing in the report is that these countries also were the ones that mobilized climate finance. So again, when you are less climate vulnerable, you have higher opportunity of getting climate finance, which is some form of misalignment of resources. So we'll come back to that as we go forward. Here is just the socioeconomic impacts of climate change, which for me is the raison d'etre for African governments to take climate change really seriously. Between 1986 and 2015, Africa lost 5 to 15% of GDP per capita growth due to climate change. And this is in addition to the loss of lives, the climate-induced insecurity, and conflicts, and all those things that happen across the continent. But other social consequences are also there. We try to look at why is this happening, and you'll find, again, economic structures is part of it, institutional capacity is part of it, and there are several factors that are drivers of these impacts, where the impacts are higher than in other countries. That we can look at going forward. Then this brings us to thinking of climate justice, because already in this picture I'm painting, you can see that the flow of climate finance doesn't seem to be going to the more vulnerable. So the more vulnerable you are to climate change, the less likely you are even to get the financing that is being made available for countries to address this climate change. But another important thing is that the major driver of climate change is the energy systems of countries. But we also know that SDG 7 is about universal access to energy for the reasons that we have talked about. So there are some trade-offs that we need to think about here. We need access to energy, but we also need to mitigate climate, because Africa is suffering more, and because of its high vulnerability, is a major policy stance for Africa to address climate change. So if you look at this picture here, there is no gainsaying the fact that GDP growth and access to energy is highly correlated. So if you reduce access to energy, you are just simply reducing socioeconomic development of the country. So we have to keep this in mind when we are talking about energy transitions, which one is just and which one is not just. And here we then try to look into history. How is the energy mix of countries? How has it been for the different regions? So we looked at Africa, China, European Union, India, and United States. The gray part of here is coal. And you can see that Africa has reduced coal in its emission significantly, from about 56% to about 29% of its mix between 1985 and 2020. And the other regions that have similar transitions are European Union and the United States of America. For the other regions, you see how high coal is and remains in their energy mix. But another thing we see there is that transitions take time. It's not something that happens quickly. So that time it takes, and these countries, the regions that have managed, used gas as a transition fuel. So gas is a central aspect of being able to decouple from coal. And this is why you continue to see this call by the African Development Bank that gas must remain part of the energy mix of the continent, while not compromising the Paris Climate Agreement. Another point to see here is that renewable energy has increased, but has not increased really significantly. That's the green line on top there. The highest growth is in European Union, where it has reached up to 29% of the energy mix. So while renewable remain an important part of the energy mix, it's still not yet there in terms of technological efficiency and capacity to replace everything in the energy mix. So we looked at Africa's energy mix vis-a-vis other regions, and we'll find that Africa's energy mix is actually less carbon intensive than most of the other regions as well. So here we look at the carbon emissions. This is what the president was talking about in terms of looking at the carbon budget of the world, how much of it is still available, how much has been spent, and what is remaining, and how can we have an equitable allocation of this carbon budget that remains in order to meet net zero transitions and have some kind of equity in terms of historical emissions, current emissions, and future emissions, and the need to grow economies. So from that analysis, of course, we know that emissions from Africa is very little, less than about 3% of the historical emissions. Here is then the calculation of the carbon, what we call the carbon credits and carbon debts of different regions of the world. Policy shifts and market shifts mean that continued investment in fossil fuel energy systems is simply has what we've called asset stranding risks. So we need to be able to move with the times. Chapter 3, financing this climate resilience and just energy transitions. We find that the current climate financing architecture mirrors the global financing architecture. And because of that, the structure is very complicated and loosely defined. Almost everything can be branded climate finance. In Africa, we have about 2/3 of the climate finance flows that came into the continent in the past decades were actually debt. And 33% of that was non-concessional debt. So this raises questions about how do we is giving debt, accumulating debt for countries that are more vulnerable to climate change, poorer, and that is deepening the debt sustainability challenges in these countries, increasing social fragility, economic fragility, and we also know that these things lead to environmental degradation. So it's a vicious cycle. Flow of climate finance, we've already talked about it. It's misaligned with climate vulnerability and risks. And this is just a picture that will show you that. Being more prone to climate impacts doesn't mean that you get more climate finance because of several issues, institutional capacity, several things. I'm not going to go into it. Read the report and we can find it. Now, more importantly, it's also misaligned with the scale of climate finance that is required for Africa to be able to reach net zero. Remember that in the Paris Climate Agreement, there were conditional nationally determined contributions and non-conditional nationally determined contributions. Those conditional nationally determined contributions was dependent on global climate finance coming into this continent. And what we have estimated is that to implement that NDCs of Africa requires up to $1.6 trillion, not billion, 1.6 trillion US dollars between 2020 and 2030. But Africa has only received annually 18.3 billion in the past decade, for that period shown there, 2016 to 2019. So this leaves us with up to 127 billion US dollars in climate finance gap annually. If you look at the average, it comes to like 108 billion per year. So in current trends, the risk of not being able to implement the NDCs in Africa is real. And the implications for global sustainability and meeting net zero, I will leave us to think about it as we go forward. Policy recommendations. One key area is policy coordination, ensuring that fiscal policy and monetary policy work together to build economies, achieve resilience, and also protect the vulnerable. The second one is building and strengthening regional value chains. For reasons I don't think I need to explain after COVID-19. We all see why it is necessary. The scale of investments in renewable energy is still low, not only in Africa, but across the world. We need to scale up massively if we have to change that trajectory in the energy mix that we showed you. So investing in institutional capacity development for green transitions, technologies, markets, commodities, and so on is very important, so that Africa doesn't remain an exporter of raw materials for this new development paradigm we are seeing, just as we have been doing before. Because if you operate at that low level of your value chain, you will get low level of resources flowing into your economy. There are no two ways about that. So we need to engage in terms of building capacity to be able to produce technologies at home and use these technologies so that we can move forward. Some other work we've done with the International Resources Panel show that the carbon footprint of some of the technologies we call renewable are not really renewable, because the raw materials go from Africa to a different region, it's produced there and it's shipped back, and guess what? It's running on gas. Not gas, actually, it's diesel. So when you build all these things in terms of the carbon that was included in terms of the production, the exportation of raw materials, the re-importation of it, for Africa, the carbon footprint of even solar panels may not really be very sustainable. So we need to think about that by localizing the industries, building the industries here, and ensuring that we benefit from that. So this leaves us with a very clear imperative for the international community. Honoring the 100 billion. If you look at what is owed and what is promised and what the flow is now, it tells its own story. The next one is expanding innovation to deepen financing instruments. We have green bonds, sustainability-linked bonds. There are several financial innovations that can be done by countries and by multilateral development banks so that we can help Africa to be able to come out of this quagmire. Increasing concessional financing to support climate adaptation and just energy transition is key, because climate finance, as currently structured, does not flow to the vulnerable countries. So and this is why, like a higher ADF replenishment and allowing ADF to go to market is imperative for Africa to adapt to climate change. Because if we depend on climate finance, it doesn't go to those who really need it most. For reasons that is very clear. Conclusions. Climate change is a global commons problem and requires collaborative action and global action to address. A global commons problem means that if I do my part and you did not do your part, all the things I have done doesn't really mean much. So we cannot push Africa to address climate change if all of us is not addressing climate change. And Europe addressing climate change will not lead far if Africa is not addressing climate change. So we all have to make sure that as a global community, we protect our common futures together. The reason is simple. Greenhouse gas emissions does not know boundaries. It accumulates in the atmosphere freely and creates impacts freely as well. So we need to make sure that that's done. Energy systems needs to be technologically adequate, cost optimal, and viable. And viability is not to meet the Paris Agreement only, but to meet that in addition to achieving universal access and driving all the other SDGs and Africa's Agenda 2063. We need decentralized renewable energy systems. This is key for rapid access to energy and to electricity, especially for countries that are still in the dark. I mean, continents where in Africa we have 600 million people still in the dark. So fast-tracking decentralized renewable energy is just obvious for us in Africa, given our resource potential. Doing that will also increase our share of the emerging global green economy. So we need to do that fast so that we are not latecomers in that as well. Significant financing, we have talked about it already. We have only looked at two aspects of financing here. COVID-19, which is a short-term issue. So we looked at just 2020-2022, 432 billion required. And then to address the NDCs, which we have already agreed to as per the Paris Agreement, requires up to 1.6 trillion US dollars. Dear deputies, excellencies, ladies and gentlemen, it's my honor to thank you for listening to this presentation and to ask us to go home with just one question. What part do I need to play to ensure that we avert climate catastrophe for the world? Thank you.
Thank you so much, Professor Orama. If I could keep you on stage, because I'd love for us to reveal the document and also invite on stage, I'm hoping the VP Kariuki can join us. There he is. And after all the work is done, it is presented to the continent. One more minute for me. Thank you so much. This is just the beginning of the journey for you, so good luck. Let's give him a final round of applause for the work done. Thank you. And so I'd like to invite on stage our panelists for the day. If they could join me on stage, Dr. Barbel Koffler, the Parliamentary State Secretary in the Federal Ministry of Economic Cooperation and Development. Please join me on stage. She's also the AFDB Governor for Germany. Mr. Ernesto Max Elias Tonella, join me please, Minister of Economy and Finance and AFDB Governor for Mozambique. Mr. Carlos San Basilio, Managing Director, Corporate Strategy and MDBs. Welcome. If Mrs. Zunaid Samsuna Ahmed can also join me on stage. I have not had the pleasure of seeing her, but I'm sure she's nearby. Minister of Finance and the Governor for Nigeria. I'll wait and see if I can get a hold of her. And our final guest is Mr. Enoch Gondongwana, Minister of Finance, AFDB Governor for South Africa. Welcome on stage. If I may be close to my own minister from South Africa. Pardon me. Thank you. And I'll move myself. Thank you so much for making the time to join us on stage. If I need to make any changes, if she arrives, my fourth panelist, let me know, but I'm willing for us to begin. Mr. Okonjo-Iweala might need to leave us a little bit earlier, so I'll come to you just shortly with your question. But I think I'd like to start us off with Mr. Basilio. Mr. Basilio, for me, really, what I'd love for you to do is to share your approach on climate resilience, really building on your experience in North Africa. What are your key thoughts?
Thank you, Zanele. And to start from my side, thank you also to the African Development Bank for inviting EBRD, the European Bank for Reconstruction and Development, to the annual meeting. We have a very solid cooperation with the African Development Bank in Northern African countries. And to respond directly to your question, we have in EBRD, of course, as other multilateral institutions, we currently have a climate at the center of our strategy. It accounts for roughly 50% of our total investment, with a total 100% of investment by the end of the year to be fully aligned with the Paris Agreement. And we have a kind of a recipe, as I told you before, Zanel, before we started the meeting, a recipe with 3 ingredients that we apply in all our countries of operations, be it Eastern Europe, Central Asia, Northern Africa, and particularly Northern Africa has been working very well, in Egypt, in Morocco, in Tunisia. And these 3 ingredients of the recipe that works for us in promoting net zero emissions are the following. First, it is necessary that every country has a clear strategy of not only of where it wants to go, but also how it wants to get there. So it's not only about NDCs, but it's also about LTS, the long-term strategy. This is an instrument that we think is going to be very useful for countries to design their strategy going forward for a zero emission. So the first element is a clear strategy, clear goals, and clear actions. The second is, of course, there's going to be necessary a lot of investment. And be it public, be it private, be it international, be it national or multinational. But the 3 element is key if you want to have access to this investment. This third element is the regulatory framework and the right policies. And you basically need the 3 of these elements to make sure that the country can make progress in terms of the green agenda. You need, again, the strategy, you need the investment, and you need the policy. And that's the way we have dealt with the different cases we have had in Northern Africa. In Egypt, for instance, we have made a lot of progress on renewables with 26 projects and 1.3 gigawatts already deployed there. In Morocco, we've been working on some innovative solutions for private-to-private use of renewable, trying to minimize also something that has been presented in the document before, increase the debt burden for the sovereigns. So from our side in EBRD, our focus is private sector, and we aim at mobilizing as much as possible private sector investment for the private sector in the different countries where we operate. But it's not only Egypt. In Morocco, we've been doing some very interesting projects in terms also of hydropower. And also in Tunisia, we've been engaging with SMEs also because they also play their role in promoting the green agenda. So we think that an engagement with the local authorities is fundamental for multilateral institutions, but it's also fundamental that the local authorities have a view that combines the need for investment with the need for actions from their side to favor that this investment is mobilized and comes to their countries.
Thank you. I marvel at the complexity of the collaboration required between various stakeholders. It's something we've always struggled with, and I hope we are getting better at collaborating and bringing parties together with actually sustainable results. So it's really, I marvel at that. So you spoke about strategy, policy, and investment being key. I want to pose my next question to you, Mr. Okonjo-Iweala, because we possibly have an opportunity here to accelerate co-benefits of just energy transitions in Africa. What are we doing to leverage, to learn from each other, and to accelerate these benefits that we can achieve across the different governments? I think it's on.
It's on. Yeah, look, the first thing is to say what is the common challenge? one of the common challenges within the African continent is that we're not the greatest emitters. We contribute about 3.8% of global emissions as African continent. Of course, there will be variations. For instance, South Africa has got a more concentration in 90% of South Africa's electricity generated from coal. So there will be the variations within the African continent, but globally as a continent, we contribute less. So that's the first point. The second point is that in that environment, if we contribute less, what is going to be required is what kind of support measures are going to come from the developed world, which will have us reap these crop of benefits. They've already promised $100 billion US, which is not materializing, which could be a core benefit for all of us in order to transition from, you can see in the slide that was presented here, is that despite that we are one of the fastest economies on the continent in terms of moving away from coal. So with a bit of support from the developed world, which will help us to achieve those benefits, it's going to be important. It's going to be important that that happens. I mean, if most of the economy, I mean, like South Africa, if I may take our own position, is that for us to benefit, I've been discussing with some of the developed world, is that if we are going to transition effectively, it's going to be important that we emphasize the just component of the just transition. I normally cite to them that we've got one region which contains about 13 of our coal power stations and mines. To shift from those coal mines and 13 and coal power stations in that region, there's going to be huge social dislocation, which is Mpumalanga. The question is, what that means is that what the missing link is that when we talk about this thing, it's not only about planting few renewable power stations, it's a complete new development, an alternative development model. The question, how do you begin to define that? So that's a challenge. So we need an articulated strategy as countries, but also an articulated strategy for the continent in order for us to reap these benefits. That's going to be the key challenge moving forward. I think we're beginning through these discussions and African Development Bank, which is beginning to use its muscle in order to mobilize finances which are going to benefit all of us in order to transition effectively into a zero emission by 2050. Thank you.
Thank you so much. And I think you speak of transitioning from coal to completely new solutions, and you speak about Mpumalanga, so it's not just about transitioning areas, but it's also about transitioning the people that are part of those economies.
Correct.
And those now are the conversations that when the rubber hits the road is, how are we going to do that? How do we create new solutions and take our people with? I'd like to move over to a video that we have to play by His Excellency Ms. Mia Mottley, the Prime Minister of Barbados. Take a few minutes and listen to some thoughts from her.
Good day all protocols of course being observed. I want to say how delighted I am that you've asked me to share a few words with you today, and I wish I could be there in person. But as you know, I'm strongly of the view that our regions, Africa and the Caribbean, have a moral responsibility to become closer as we seize our Atlantic destinies on both sides. I could speak at length on these matters, but today is not that time. For today we're going to speak about the climate crisis and how both of us in the Caribbean and in Africa are on the receiving end of this crisis that we didn't cause. In essence, we are unjustly and disproportionately impacted by issues that we did not create. There's no doubting it. The world's climate has been changing. You see it in Africa, we see it in the Caribbean, and with devastating consequences. At the same time, scientific research has also shown us that that temperatures on the African continent are warming faster than the global average over land and oceans. In fact, the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change has predicted that critical global warming levels will likely be reached in Africa earlier than the middle of this century. In our own case in the Caribbean, we expect it, if things don't change, to be as early as within 15 years. These are dangerously worrying situations for both of us. And in your case in the continent, it comes with an already difficult situation that you face in terms of the development trajectory. The level of poverty in Africa remains too high, with more than 470 million Africans expected to live in extreme poverty this year. And according to the World Food Programme, 2 years ago in 2020, almost 100 million people in Africa suffered from acute food insecurity and needed humanitarian assistance. This is the base from which you start. And with the advent of more frequent and more severe climate-related disasters such as floods and windstorms and droughts, hurricanes, landslides, and pest outbreaks, more lives will be upended and more livelihoods totally destroyed. It is with this utmost urgency and understanding, therefore, that we must fully come to grips with current and future implications that this climate crisis will have to us as human beings, as those who are most vulnerable. Already the socioeconomic impact that it is having in Africa is substantial and widespread, as you know. And reports have shown that it is threatening to derail your region's development gains in the same way that our region's development gains have been displaced. The truth is that we are told that the cost to the continent will be at least $50 billion annually by the year 2030. Concurrently, the reduction in GDP per capita growth in high warming scenario that is being modeled is projected between 16 to 64% by 2030, depending on where you look. My friends, despite these precarious economic, social, and climatic positions, African countries remain committed to addressing the global climate challenges through their nationally determined contributions to the reducing of global carbon emissions. It cannot be ignored, however, that the most developed and emerging economies have overwhelmingly contributed to this current predicament. Scientists concluded that about 85% of the global carbon budget is already used up, with only 400 gigatons of carbon dioxide equivalent left if the net zero goal is to be achieved by 2050. The reality is that a large proportion of those global carbon credits have come from developed and emerging economies. In fact, Africa's historical and current share of the global carbon emissions has measured less than 3%. Less than 3%. It is therefore unjust that despite African countries contributing so little to this climate crisis, its impacts and its effects are also so disproportionately distributed as it is in the region. That is why we call for a simple definition for climate vulnerability, and that definition can simply be stated, and transparently so, that if your country is likely to suffer from climatic consequences that will have an impact on more than 5% of your GDP, then you ought to be considered as a climate vulnerable country. We need this kind of transparent definition if we are to see greater progress with international financial markets and international financial institutions being able to transparently support our efforts to do the adaptation and the mitigation that is so necessary now. The mitigation will, of course, unlock private sector funds, but the adaptation doesn't have a revenue stream that will make it easy for the private sector to involve themselves in, and hence adaptation funds will have to be borne at the cost of either the balance sheet of our countries or indeed through the receipt of grant fundings. This has, of course, nothing to do with the fiscal space that is immediately available to us. So if we are to truly discuss climate justice and to see that it prevails, the current global climate finance architecture has to be reformed. And this will therefore allow you to lift millions of your people out of poverty, while at the same time building your climate resilience by ensuring that you develop all of your available energy resources. And I mean all, and I'll come to that later in my speech, that are clean. During COP26, I asked, what must we say to our people living on the front line in the Caribbean, or in Africa, or in the Pacific, when both ambition and some of the needed faces to be at meetings are absent? And what excuse should we give for their failure? In the words of Eddie Grant, I said then, will they mourn us on the front line? I repeat them today. Of the $100 billion US that was committed by developed countries to developing countries for climate adaptation, in 2019, only $79.6 billion was mobilized. And of course, that $100 billion had a different level of impact when it was stated 5-6 years ago. Africa, in 2019, of that $79.6 billion, received only $18.5 billion when the funds were mobilized. I say to you again that without the sufficient financial resources and support, developing countries will not be able to build their climate resilience or address the extreme energy poverty or to successfully transition themselves to a net zero path by 2050. I've made the case for the Caribbean and developing nations, and I'll make it here again. The extent of resources needed for the climate crisis actions and for just energy transition has fallen far, far short of the expectations, or in fact, what is needed to be able to protect us sufficiently. What currently exists is highly fragmented, with multiple stakeholders often having overlapping mandates, complex rules and regulations, and stringent requirements. There is need for better harmonization of the requirements and better coordination of all existing climate funds so that it can redound to successfully building more resilient countries and most importantly, as we all know, to improve our ability to save lives, not in the tens of thousands or hundreds of thousands, but in millions. There is need as well for a greater access and ownership of this architecture. Currently, all global climate funds are based outside of Africa, and so at best they can only attempt to understand and address the continent's special needs and circumstances on this crisis. Improving Africa's ownership of these funds and access to these funds in terms of your objectives, implementation actions, and expected results is critical if we are going to ensure that there's a buy-in also by your local communities and leaders. There also needs to be greater consideration to augmenting pre-existing commitments to adequately reflect the true opportunity costs of this crisis in Africa and other developing regions, as well as to leverage existing innovative climate finance instruments. Green finance instruments such as green bonds or green loans can help in that regard. The use of government guarantees to unlock significant amounts of funds is also one that we should be pursuing. Carbon markets, debt for climate swaps, and climate-linked debt instruments are also other financial instruments that ought to be explored. We in Barbados here are seeking to do a variation of a debt for nature swap. And with the help of the Inter-American Development Bank and Nature's Conservancy, we are now about to repurchase a significant portion of our debt, $150 million US, and the interest savings that will be garnered from that exercise will be used to be able to establish and finance a marine conservation trust. But we are only scratching the surface. We need to see the pledging of existing SDRs made available to regional development banks to give them the opportunity to be able to pursue all of these types of innovative steps. Attracting the private sector is equally important to scaling up climate finance on the continent, particularly in the areas of mitigation. For example, we can also look at blended finance to de-risk private green finance instrument investments in Africa. And while green banks and national climate funds could further be promoted to help mobilize more climate finance domestically, we are not seeing sufficient movement with respect to these. My friends, we must also address the elephant in the room. And what is that? The International Energy Agency expects that net zero in 2050 does not mean no fossil fuels. It means limited fossil fuel usage. And what is that limited usage? That 20% of the mix is still expected to come from fossil fuels. But what cannot happen is that we determine that only those who are currently in the business of fossil fuels have that opportunity to utilize their resources to be able to finance the transition that they need to net zero. Indeed, Everyone acknowledges that natural gas will be and must be that bridge of clean energy in the transition to renewables. And to that extent, therefore, we must have serious discussions as to who can appropriately be able to unlock their fossil fuel potential while not going overboard, while not impacting on the clear ambitions that we must maintain to ensure climate justice in this world. But to simply assume that only those with existing resources should have that opportunity and that no new exploitation should take place is to literally disproportionately impact and affect developing countries yet again. Finally, African nations must also address the issues of the institutional, regulatory, and supportive policy reforms if we are to unlock this climate finance and to ensure that our citizens benefit justly. In my own country, we have just announced that every citizen who is a homeowner should have as of right access to renewable energy resources, primarily photovoltaic panels, but in some instances, micro wind turbines. Why? Because the wind and the sun and the water do not belong to any of us singularly. They are the patrimony of our countries, and they must be used to enfranchise and to protect our citizens as far as possible. I commend my friends, as I close, African countries and leaders for their efforts in the front line of this crisis. Much like the challenges we face here in the Caribbean, the climate finance flows we all know have not been commensurate with our needs and climate justice. And we are running out of time. It will take concerted efforts of all stakeholders to support this climate resilience we must develop and the just energy transition that must be taking place in Africa and in the Caribbean. In the face of the climate crisis, your cause is our cause. Climate justice and better financing of climate resilience is critical if we are truly to address the crisis which confronts us all. And let me end by sharing one last example of what we have been able to do. Barbados is now currently the largest issuer of bonds with natural disaster clauses. Had the world given the developing countries the opportunity to have natural disaster and pandemic clauses during the course of these last 2 years, it would have unlocked trillions of dollars rather than the modest debt service suspension initiative of 12 billion that was established by the international financial institutions as a mechanism for helping only poor countries. It would have been able to assist middle-income countries. It would have been able to avert the loss of lives in serious ways by ensuring that governments had access to greater liquidity and to be able to ensure that they could support and shield the most vulnerable in our populations. My friends, these things are not rocket science, but what they require is political will and sensitivity. Sensitivity to hear people, see people, and feel people, and to know that our obligations within the responses of governments and the private sector, development finance institutions, is to be able to create that framework that makes their lives easier and better, and not putting them, regrettably, on the front line in our own countries on this climate crisis that we did not create. I believe we can do better. I believe we can do more. But we require partnership, and we require the same message being repeated over and over. Let us, to the task, ensure that we create that pathway to protect the people of Africa and the people of the Caribbean. Thank you very much.
And that was the Minister of Barbados, Minister Mia Motley. Thank you so much for her contribution. I hope we have time for a few more sessions. Unfortunately, I left my mobile, so I cannot read the messages sent. Big apologies, but I know that I have a few more minutes for two of my panelists to do their part. So if I could start with you, Governor Koffler. For me, she spoke a little bit about the innovative tools we would need to finance this journey. We have to work at speed, and yet we are working with Africans solving for their own issues. We're looking at women and young people to come in. Can we be innovative in financing, and can we execute with speed?
we not only can, but we have to. It was crystal clear by everyone who was speaking. It was crystal clear by the report presented and also what was said just before. We have to speed up, and we have to speed up with action and with financing. So we are trying, of course. I don't know if I have the clue or the answer to any of the questions raised today, but what we are trying to do is speeding up on a bilateral level as Germany to come up with climate and development partnerships where we really want to combine the issues of transition to renewable energies, combining it with social aspects, with partnership aspects, how we can do so, how we can build up together capacity to transform the energy system and get it done together with the society, with civil society, with scientists, with various groups, interested groups in both sides of the partnership. That's something we can do, and we have to speed up bilaterally. That's from my ministry. I can speak, the Minister of Economic Cooperation and Development, a program we are really focusing on those climate and development partnerships. But we have to do more than only bilateral transactions. We have to speed up on a European level, and we have to speed up on a multilateral level. So I think the just energy transition partnerships are of big importance. It was pointed out a little bit by the minister from South Africa. It's always both sides of the medal. You have to have acceptance in a society, and there are people who are losing if we do transition. That's clear. We see that in our countries. We have areas of coal mining, and we have to do something then for the social and economical future of those areas and those people. And that's the same, if I look on South Africa or other countries, we have to do something on this social economical portfolio and to start with the transformation in renewable energies. We have to do both. And we have to do it combined. It was the question about the political will, about the framework to do so. And of course about the ownership of the countries we are talking to and we are working with. So that's the Just Energy Transition Partnership. I think that is quite important from a European level and from a multilateral level. That's something which is very important now for us in Germany in the G7 presidency to really speed up and really scale up those partnerships. But it was also quite clear here, it's not only about those partnerships and transforming the energy systems, it's of course also of mitigation in our own countries. We've seen the statistics, and it's always quite painful to see those statistics. It was clear, or it is clear, that we have to change our systems in Europe, in other countries, developed countries, to hinder the effects or to stop the effects on the whole world. So we have to work on mitigation in our own countries, and we have to do a lot on adaptation. We very much welcome that at the COP27 coming up, topics like adaptation and loss and damage are high ranking on the agenda. We would love to support that. We are trying, for example, from our ministry, well, as a whole, the plan is in Germany to put in 6 billion a year, beginning, we already put around 4 billion in, but starting with 6 billion in 2025 and doing that every year. And financing with that, not only mitigation, but also adaptation issues, which are very, very urgent. We will learn today again. For my ministry, we are doing about 40% of our portfolio in adaptation and in projects and programs. And we are very much engaged also in building up a global shield against climate risks if it's coming to most vulnerable people and countries. And under that shield, I think it was in your report, Professor Rama, there should be a more systematic approach, political approach to deal with climate risks. So that is one of the goals of that shield. What we did in the past, and it's, I think, from the G7 meeting in 2015, one of the results, coming up with a kind of inter-resilience partnership in between G20 and V20 countries to come up with ideas on resilience, on climate risks, insurance on climate risk, to really, well, especially support those who are most suffering from climate change. So in a nutshell, as quick as possible.
That was really fantastic, and we did yesterday see a lot of examples of what we have been able to do to, as you speak to the insurance and to the support of communities that are hardest hit. And we have the case studies, and we've shown that we can do it, so we need to keep on doing it in order to reap the results. And the continent is saying we can do it, let's finance, let's keep on doing it. And then we also saw the numbers of people sliding into poverty. So on top of that, you're dealing with the pandemic results, then there's the Russia-Ukraine. So good luck. I know that it's a formidable task, but we have good hands at it. And Governor Tonela, thank you for your patience. You have to speak to us of how you see the role of gas in the energy mix for the countries going forward. We know that it is key that energy services, climate action, in the SDGs, they're all very much linked. So how do we ensure that gas plays its proper role in that energy mix?
Thank you very much. If you allow me, I will be speaking in Portuguese. Bom, muito obrigado. Nós vivemos já uma era de transição energética. Se olharmos para as projeções de crescimento da população mundial até 2050, combinado com a continuidade do êxito rural das pessoas do campo para a cidade e também com os fatores associados ao incremento da produção global e do rendimento per capita, percebemos que há uma projeção de incremento da procura de produtos energéticos. As alterações climáticas impõem ao mundo uma nova abordagem, que é o uso de energias e combustíveis mais limpos e menos poluentes. Neste processo de transição para energias renováveis, temos alguns desafios, alguns constrangimentos. O ministro sul-africano colocou alguns, que têm a ver com a transição, tendo em conta o impacto sobre a situação económica e social de cada um dos países, mas também temos aqui o facto de as fontes renováveis ainda serem intermitentes e nós precisamos de assegurar fornecimentos de segurança, portanto, garantam o base load no fornecimento de energia em todo o mundo para assegurar a continuidade do desenvolvimento social e económico. E aí vemos no gás como a alternativa, por ser uma fonte fóssil, mas relativamente limpa, havendo também processos possíveis de retirar parte do carbono do que o gás tem. Moçambique dispõe de reservas comprovadas de mais de 180 trilhões de pés cúbicos de gás natural, que pode ser usado e deve ser usado para contribuir para a redução e mitigar a situação neste processo de transação e vai constituir um importante ator no componente de produção e exportação de gás natural, contribuindo deste modo para a transição energética no continente africano, mas também no mundo. A entrada em operação da central flutuante de produção de gás natural liquefeito este ano, no último trimestre, com uma capacidade de 3,4 milhões de toneladas por ano, marcará, portanto, o início de uma nova era para o nosso país. Deixaremos de ser um país produtor e exportador pequeno para passarmos a ter um papel relevante a nível de exportadores mundiais de gás. Temos estado a trabalhar a nível da região da SADC, temos da parceria bilateral, mas também estamos a concluir um processo de desenvolvimento do plano diretor, portanto, master plan do gás natural, que vai permitir que o gás possa ser usado para a transformação da economia dos países da região austral, mas também, tendo em conta a proporção das reservas que dispomos, temos projetos em pipeline para transformação em líquido e, deste modo, facilitar o transporte para mercados como o europeu, asiático e outros países do continente. Portanto, é um recurso que tem um potencial enorme de transformação económica, não só através das receitas que advirão das exportações, mas também contribuir para o aumento do crescimento económico e também da diversificação da economia moçambicana. E aí contamos com o suporte do Banco Africano de Desenvolvimento também nos processos de financiamento, sobretudo neste segundo projeto que está a decorrer de implantação em terra. Portanto, um dos desafios que teremos, portanto, é assegurar continuidade de financiamento para tornar realidade os projetos que possam permitir beneficiar das reservas que dispomos. Obrigado.
Thank you so much. We close on a high note after your talk because we see that there are opportunities that countries can leverage not only for the continent but globally as well. We are a growing continent and energy is absolutely key to that growth. We can only have so much of these conversations today, but I hope that it has been enriching enough that we should further these conversations when we get back into our home countries and spend the time looking at the report and engaging on what it actually means for the efforts that we were putting in.